Well, why are you lying here again? You should be heading home, Carol said, stepping over the man lying on the landing. He mumbled something but didn't attempt to get up. What's he even drinking? Probably buying cheap booze off someone, Carol muttered. She'd heard that Jordan was often refused alcohol in the local stores, at least not as often as he wanted. God sent us a neighbor, what can you say, and for what sins? She turned around. He was lying on his stomach, head turned to the side, one hand clenched into a fist beneath him. Comfortable there, huh? Or does it not matter? Carol said softly. Jordan, go home, she said gently. You'll freeze. It's autumn after all. He opened his eyes and looked at her with almost coherent eyes. I'll go later, he grumbled. Now, go now. Carol raised her voice. Don't bother people. One of the doors opened. Carol saw an elderly woman in a flowery flannel robe over a gray turtleneck. She didn't know all the neighbors yet, hadn't had a chance to introduce herself to everyone. She wasn't acquainted with this woman either. The woman looked at Jordan first, then at Carol. Jordan, get up, she said. Jordan obediently rolled onto his back and sat up, burying his face in his knees. Then he tried to stand up and failed. The woman in the robe approached him and reached out her hand. Come on, Jordan, you need to get up. Just one floor and you're home. I'll help, she said. Are you really bothering with him? Carol grumbled. Why bother with someone like him? Third time I've stumbled upon him and my daughter complained. We should report him to the police, let them take him somewhere else. The woman sighed. Recently moved into Adam's apartment on the 5th floor? Yeah, Carol replied. So what? Oh, nothing. The woman offered her shoulder to Jordan, who leaned on it like a drowning man on a lifebuoy. No need to call. He's not bothering you, not causing a ruckus, not fighting, the woman said. No, but he sleeps where he shouldn't, Carol said. He's a young man. He should be working, but he drinks like crazy. Dear, go home, the woman waved her hand. I'll handle it. Jordan, let's go. Come on. Left, right, the neighbor said. Carol shook her head and dashed up the stairs to her 5th floor apartment. If this woman wanted to deal with the drunkard, fine by her. Carol had other things to worry about. She still needed to make dinner. She was already exhausted, which, however, had become her usual state over the past few years. Carol entered the apartment and collapsed onto the chair she'd placed in the hallway for putting on boots more comfortably. She closed her eyes and leaned against the wall. Oh God, am I really home? Those 12-hour shifts were a real trial, but there was nothing to be done. She had to take whatever job she could find. It turned out to be a packing job at the local confectionery factory. Carol comforted herself that it was temporary, just until there were vacancies at the hospital. Then it would be easier. She shuddered. That thought. It'll be easier later. How many times had she consoled herself with that? Back in childhood, seeing her drunken parents. Later, it'll be easier. In school, struggling to pass yet another exam. How could she study when there was either a domestic quarrel or another drinking spree at home? Later, it'll be easier. Once she gets into college. It'll be easier when she starts working. It'll be easier when she starts a family. Her own family, where they'd love each other, where alcohol would be off limits. Later, it'll be easier. And what about both of her pregnancies? The woman was suffering from morning sickness, literally forcing herself out of bed every morning because she simply had no strength, and yet she went to work because money was needed. She thought, once I give birth, it'll be easier. But when would it actually get easier? When Carol retired. Hi, Mom. 7-year-old Sally, Carol's youngest daughter, appeared in the hallway. Nick and I made dinner for you. Are you coming? What's for dinner, sweetheart? Carol smiled. Macaroni and cheese, as usual, Sally said. Oh, and salad, but it's just cucumber salad because we didn't have anything else. But it still turned out tasty. Let's go. Yes, cucumber salad is good. The woman nodded, pulling off her boots. Is Nick already asleep? He is. Sally approached her moom and picked up one of her bags. Can I take this to the kitchen? I'll do it myself. Go brush your teeth and go to bed. It's already 10 o'clock. Why didn't Nick put you to bed? He did, but I got up again, Sally shrugged. I wanted to wait for you. I have a day off tomorrow. We'll go skiing together, and Nick will go for a walk with us. Can't he ski too? Sally's face darkened. No, he can't, Carol replied, getting up from the chair and rubbing her sore lower back. You know that, honey. Once he's better, he'll be able to run, jump, and ski. Carol ate the dinner lovingly prepared by her children. It's amazing how even such simple food can taste amazingly delicious when you know it was made with love. And she had raised good kids. Perhaps the only thing Carol truly prided herself on in life. Nick is already 13, quite grown up, funny, serious, and passionate about programming. He adores mathematics. Carol would love to give him more opportunities to develop his talents. But how to do that in Allentown? Carol paid for online courses and tutors for her son. God willing, he'll get into university. She had no doubt Nick had the abilities for it. The teacher at the local school was shocked by his knowledge. She said he was 3 years ahead in math, and in physics he had already read textbooks for 11th grade and moved on to university-level ones. The prodigy is growing up. Will his health hold up? That's the question. Carol's eldest child had a heart defect, a complex one requiring a pacemaker to be installed. For now, they're managing, but by the time he's 18, they'll probably have to install it. And Carol was terribly afraid of that. It was hard for her to imagine her boy with some unknown device in his body, his life depending on it. But there was nothing to be done. That's how he was born. Carol blamed herself for it. She was nervous during pregnancy, and here was the result. But how not to be nervous with a husband like Zach, just as much of a drunkard as Jordan? It was impossible to think at the beginning, when everything was just starting, that Zach would trade his family for a bottle of liquor. At least Sally was born healthy. Carol wouldn't have been able to handle 2 sick children. Nick needed expensive medicines, tests, and money for the operation needed to be saved up. Maybe they'll do it for free, of course, but you can never be sure. In any case, there will be rehabilitation afterward, and it's unclear how much it will cost. Carol finished her meal and started washing the dishes. She was terribly upset. Why do some people have to work their entire lives to get their children on their feet, and no one helps them? Zach does contribute, of course, but it's not enough. And then there are some like Jordan who everyone seems to want to help. They sympathize. Carol had only lived in this house for 2 months, and already she knew that the neighbors brought soups to this drunkard in plastic containers. Oh, Jordan, and if he gets so drunk that he can't make it to his apartment, they wake him up and bring him there. Carol wished someone would help her. Why doesn't anyone cook soups for her? And why do people always sympathize with all sorts of drunks? They only bring troubles. Carol was sure that the best solution would be to gather them all, put them on a steamship, and take them to a deserted island. Maybe if they had to survive on their own without anyone's help, they'd quickly lose the urge for alcohol. Take her Zach, for example. Maybe he wouldn't drink if it weren't for his mom. She's too caring. She'll feed him, give him drinks, and even give him money for alcohol. Meanwhile, she'll tell everyone how awful Carol is, makes him work, pours his vodka down the drain. She can even yell when Zach crawls home once again. What a witch. But his mom, she's a good one. She'll always welcome him with open arms. Carol grimaced. How had she put up with Zach for so long? She was afraid to leave him and thought she couldn't manage alone. But in reality, it became easier without him. Things were good with the children, peaceful. There was no more constant worry about what state Zach would be in today. After finishing washing the dishes, Carol quickly took a shower and went to her room. Well, to the living room, where her sofa bed was. The children had their own room, albeit shared between the 2 of them. Well, at least there's that. Well, nothing. There's work, there's a roof over their heads. The rest will fall into place. It'll be easier later. Living in Allentown wasn't Carol's plan. She was born in a village. Even as a child, she knew she was drawn to the big city. Of course, she couldn't afford New York or Chicago. Everyone aspired to go there, and it's hard to find your place under the sun in the conditions of fierce competition. Moving to the neighboring town was quite a worthy goal. Life in the village seemed like a nightmare to her. There was no work, and if there was any, they paid peanuts, and the option was to either work at the furniture factory or at the poultry farm where her parents worked. They earned little, but it was enough for drinking. All weekends passed in a drunken haze. Friends of her parents came to the apartment. The company gathered in the kitchen, and drinking sessions could last for 2 days straight. Carol would either leave the house or lock herself in her room. But it was easier to leave because when Carol stayed, there was a constant knock on the door. They either needed her to run to the store or outright invited her to join, especially when she became a teenager. For some reason, guests thought Carol was already mature enough to enjoy the pleasures of alcohol intoxication. As she grew older, Carol often wondered why she hadn't started drinking either. Many of her peers, who experienced similar family situations, became addicted by the age of 18. But apparently, she was lucky. Carol adored biology, and in school she befriended a teacher, Miss Adams. Seeing the girl's interest in her subject, the teacher started bringing her books. Carol read all of them, often at night under her blanket, armed with a pocket flashlight. Carol used to run to Miss Adams when her parents got drunk and became incoherent. Perhaps thanks to her teacher, Carol grew up to be a normal person. They never discussed her parents, but Miss Adams understood everything. Everyone at school knew that Carol came from a troubled family. The girl would just go to her and sit until late at night, sometimes even staying overnight. The teacher's place was quiet and peaceful, smelling of books and delicious food. Carol loved sitting in the deep armchair with another encyclopedia. Birds, mammals, marine dinosaurs, there was everything. Miss Adams had collected her library since her student days, so Carol always found something new and interesting. "You need to go to college," the teacher would say. "To the biology faculty, or at least to the pedagogical one. There's less competition there, you'll get in. And I'll put in a word for you. I have a friend in the dean's office. We studied together." Carol really dreamed of going to university, but she understood that she didn't have the opportunity. She wanted to leave as soon as possible. So there was only one option: medical courses. And then, maybe she could go to college later. The main thing was to get a profession and become independent from her parents. Carol managed to implement her plan. Right after school, she packed a small suitcase and bought a bus ticket to the city. Miss Adams was the only one to see her off. She handed her a bag of sandwiches and an envelope with money. "It's not much, but it'll be enough for a start, so save it," she said. Thank you, I can't take it." Carol tried to put the envelope in the teacher's pocket. "Oh no, you already have a small salary." "Take it," Miss Adams frowned. "I have no one, I spend little, I save, I have nothing to spend it on, but you'll need it. Just spend it wisely, Carol, because I know how it goes. You'll come to the city, want to dress up, want to sit in a cafe, buy only what you need. And if anything, be sure to call me. I wrote down my number on a piece of paper. Don't forget." Carol almost cried then. Her biological parents didn't care. They calmly accepted the news that their daughter was leaving, perhaps forever. Only her mother wished for Carol to pass her exams and enroll in courses. And her father? He didn't seem to notice at all that she was packing her things. "Thank you. I'll never forget you." And Carol hugged her teacher, then jumped on the bus. Ahead was a new life. She believed she could handle it as long as she didn't have to come back, as long as she could enroll and get a profession in the city. Carol enrolled in the courses. They gave her a room in the dormitory, and the room seemed to her like a paradise. Only one roommate, the kind-hearted Naomi. When Carol entered the room, Naomi looked up from the book she was reading and said, "You're the new roommate, aren't you?" "Yes," Carol nodded. "They told me to go to room 25, so here I am." "Oh, that's good," Naomi smiled. "Make yourself at home. This bed is free. This locker is yours too. The desk is shared. We'll take turns. Do you have a laptop?" "No," Carol said, flustered. "Will I need one?" "You will," Naomi sighed. "Don't worry, you can use mine. I don't mind. Or go to the computer lab. We have it good here, but the guys always make a mess. Sometimes I have to scold them. Anyway, settle in and ask if you need anything. I'll help." Naomi turned out to be a wonderful roommate. She gave Carol her notes and essays, told her about the teachers. Living with her was easy. The girls cooked lunches together, took turns cleaning the room and mopping the floors. When Naomi finished the courses, Carol even cried. She didn't want to lose such a roommate. After completing the courses, Carol got a job at the hospital in the therapeutic department, where she had previously done her internship. She liked her job. The department mainly had elderly, calm people, and the team was good. True, they paid little, but she had enough to rent a room. She lived together with the landlady, a pensioner named Mrs. Walsh. who loved to have tea with Carol in the evenings and ask her to measure her blood pressure. Tea and blood pressure measurement became their little ritual. Mrs. Walsh had excellent blood pressure, which Carol happily reported to her. She smiled, nodded, and said, "Of course, that's because I walk a lot. Movement is the key to health, my dear." So Carol lived for 3 years. Occasionally, she visited her hometown, staying not with her parents, but with her teacher, Miss Adams. She would drop by her mother and father's house to sit for half an hour and then escape from them. They still drank, spending all their money on alcohol. Carol saw that her parents were gradually fading, and she worried. She tried to talk to them, asked them to go through rehabilitation, to quit drinking, but her parents didn't want to listen. Like almost all alcoholics, they believed they were living like everyone else, drinking like everyone else, no more and no less, within the norm. Their daughter was no longer of interest to them at all. They didn't ask how she was doing, if she liked her job, or how she was finding life in the city. They only asked for money. And sometimes it ended in a scandal. "I carried you under my heart, fed you, nurtured you," her mother cried with drunken tears. "And you, Carol, you're too stingy to spare a penny for your mother. I cooked porridge for you, and what about you? Probably in the city, you get a higher salary and you can't support your parents." Carol might have given them money, but she knew what it would be spent on. So she refused and returned to Miss Adams, to her apartment, which she already considered her true home. A real home where she was always welcome and where she would never be reproached for anything. A year later, one after another, Carol's parents passed away. She had to organize their funerals. There were no other relatives. She spent all her meager savings on it. And when she planned to claim her inheritance rights, it turned out that the apartment no longer belonged to her parents. It went to pay off the debt to the bank. Her father had taken out a loan several years ago and naturally hadn't paid a penny towards it. Carol was told she got off lightly. The apartment completely covered the debt. It could have been worse, and she would have had to pay for several more years. Carol cried a little, but didn't grieve for long. She decided for herself that she didn't need anything from her parents. She didn't inherit anything except bitter disappointment and resentment. Everything was fair. You could say she broke even. And then she met Zach, her future husband. They met at a colleague's birthday party. Carol liked Zach immediately. First of all, his appearance. He was a handsome, smiling, tall guy with blue eyes. How could you not fall in love with someone like that? And he didn't drink at all, just like Carol, who couldn't stand the smell of alcohol from childhood. All evening, he poured only orange juice into his glass. It was a huge plus in the eyes of the girl. After the birthday party, Zach volunteered to walk her home, asked her what she was doing tomorrow. Carol admitted that she was completely free, and Zach asked her out on a date. Their romance developed swiftly. Carol had never had serious relationships before, and she fell head over heels in love. Zach seemed perfect to her. He had an education. He graduated from a vocational school as a mechanic and worked at a car factory. He also had his own apartment. True, he lived with his mother. And Zach immediately declared that he was ready for a serious relationship, for a family. Carol also dreamed of a family. She wanted a hard-working, kind husband and children so that everything would be different from her parents' family. Carol was sure that she would give her children everything her mother and father didn't. Love, care, tenderness, attention. Her children wouldn't know what the smell of alcohol was like, wouldn't sit quietly in their room waiting for the noisy, drunk guests to leave so they could finally go to sleep. Zach introduced Carol to his mother. Her name was Mrs. Bailey. Carol seemed to have made a good impression on her. At least she smiled, asked Carol about her work, about her hobbies. "A nurse, that's good," nodded Mrs. Bailey, listening to Carol. "Having a medical professional in the family is wonderful, and you have connections, if anything. You can help find a good doctor." Naturally, Carol was waiting for the proposal, convinced that Zach would make it, especially since he became her first man. But Zach didn't rush, and Carol gradually fell into despair. What if he finds someone else? She searched for reasons why he hadn't proposed to her yet, and found them within herself. Not pretty enough, not educated enough, earning too little. But who would want such a bride? However, Zach did eventually propose. However, it was after Carol realized she was pregnant. At some point, the young woman realized that it was hard for her to get up in the mornings and she constantly felt like eating. Carol immediately bought 5 pregnancy tests, and they all turned out positive. She would never forget that evening. She sat, locked in the bathroom of her rented apartment, laying out the tests before her. Her mind was filled with buzzing emptiness. Carol would be a mother. She hadn't planned it this way, not at all. They were supposed to get married first, then buy a flat, and only then have children. Well, Zach had told her he had everything under control. There's your control. Becoming a mother was terribly frightening for Carol. A child, it's so expensive. And where would they live? Zach worked, of course, and she did too, but it wasn't enough. Mrs. Walsh knocked on the door. "Carol, dear, is something wrong? Are you feeling unwell?" "No, I'm okay," Carol sobbed and burst into tears. "Open up," demanded the landlady. "Don't scare an old woman." Carol obediently opened the door. Mrs. Walsh understood everything without words. And how could she not when Carol was sitting on the floor, and before her were 5 tests with 2 stripes each? She threw up her hands. "Are you pregnant?" "I am," nodded Carol. "We didn't plan it like this. Maybe I should buy another test, huh?" "How many have you done already?" 5. Carol sighed, wiping her eyes. "But you know, anything can happen. Whether it's 5 or 15, the landlady shook her head vaguely. "Let's get up. Let's go talk. You're not the first. You won't be the last." They went to the kitchen. Carol told the landlady about Zach and her moral and material unpreparedness. "Oh, why are you crying?" Mrs. Walsh was surprised. "The future father hasn't said he's against it, right? Tell him. Then you can start panicking. Besides, he has an apartment." "He does, but his mother lives there," Carol shrugged. "So what? I lived with my mother-in-law too, and nothing," Mrs. Walsh smiled. "Back then, we lived in a small apartment. My husband, his mother, me, and our baby. We managed just fine. When our son turned 5, we bought this apartment, so wipe your tears and call your Zach." "I'll definitely call him," Carol muttered. Her panic then seemed really silly, childish even. But why was she crying when Zach said he wanted children? So the baby would come a little earlier than planned. No big deal. They'd figure it out somehow. Zach took the news without enthusiasm, but he didn't panic and didn't demand an abortion. "Oh well, what can we do?" he sighed. "Maybe you should take some kind of pill, Carol." "It's too late for pills now. It should have been done right away," Carol replied. "So, what are the plans?" "Well, let's get married," Zach said lazily into the phone. "We'll live together. I'll tell my mom since it's turned out this way." "So AT's turned out this way." Carol shrugged and smiled into the phone. "You know, maybe it's even for the best. The earlier you have a baby, the better, right?" Mrs. Bailey blessed the marriage, although, as it seemed to Carol, she was displeased. She pursed her lips, furrowed her brow, and didn't smile once when Carol came to her after Zach confessed everything. "Just so you know, I can't help you financially," she said. "You made the baby yourselves, so you'll have to provide for it yourselves. Of course, I'll look after it. And take care of the apartment. I won't tolerate any mess in my house, Carol." The young woman was a little surprised then. Couldn't tolerate mess, huh? You couldn't call her future mother-in-law neat. Her things were not in their places. The sink in the bathroom was yellowed with scale, and the floors were clearly mopped once a month. I wonder what she means. Does she think Carol will be scattering dirty diapers all around? They had a wedding, modest. There wasn't enough money for a grand celebration. Carol couldn't even afford a proper wedding dress. She bought a long blue skirt and a white lace blouse. It looked okay, although not very bridal. The only ones present from the bride's side were Mrs. Adams and Naomi, her friend from the dormitory. They went to Mrs. Walsh's apartment to celebrate, where a modest table had been set in advance. Carol prepared everything herself. She loved to cook. Carol tried her best, hoping that Mrs. Bailey and Zach would appreciate her culinary talents. But Zach didn't appreciate the talents. That day he got drunk for the first time, right in front of Carol. He felt sick at the table, and then the newlywed husband went to bed without explaining or apologizing for anything. Carol was ashamed, and Mrs. Bailey paid no attention to what happened, as if Zach drank often and such behavior was normal for him. When the guests left, Mrs. Adams approached Carol. "Darling, if something goes wrong, remember, you can always come to me, okay?" "I'm married now." Carol sadly smiled at her. "I should be here, with my husband." "Oh, you silly girl," sighed the teacher. "I don't demand anything, Carol. I'm not insisting. Just know, I'll always have a place for you and your child." After the guests left, Carol washed the dishes and cleaned up. Her mother-in-law sat in the living room watching TV. Carol decided to talk. "Mrs. Bailey, excuse me, but is Zach like this? I mean today, often?" She looked at Carol displeasedly. "What do you mean?" "Well, he got really drunk." "He was nervous. Who doesn't get nervous?" Mrs. Bailey squinted. "After all, he's getting married for the first time, if you haven't noticed. And besides, men drink, it's normal. Zach's father used to drink on weekends. Don't you dare start scandals because of this. I won't tolerate it. Got it?" Carol just looked at her mother-in-law and went to her marital bedroom, where Zach was lying on the bed, arms spread, mouth open, fast asleep. She changed into pajamas, lay down next to him, curled up into a ball, and cried. It seemed she had made a terrible mistake. She could only hope that the situation could be corrected, and that she could convey to her husband that alcohol was pure evil. But Zach didn't want to listen to Carol. "What do you mean, got drunk?" her husband protested the next morning. "Well, I had a little to drink, Carol." "So what? Did I get into a fight with someone?" "No. So, what's the problem then?" "Zach, both my mom and dad drank," sighed Carol. "It starts small and then you can't stop." "Me? I can stop. I know my limits," Zach replied. And Carol grew cold. It was exactly what her father used to say to her. He knows his limits. And his limit ended somewhere after 2 or 3 bottles of vodka. It led to his death from cirrhosis of the liver at the age of 46. Carol had read somewhere that women whose fathers drank subconsciously seek out husbands like them because it's the environment they're used to. They can only live with an alcoholic. They simply cannot coexist with a normal man in the same territory. Carol believed she was different, that her husband would treat alcohol the same way she did, negatively. Psychologists turn out to be right. She's drawn to drinkers, and so it seems it will always be. But Carol decided to fight. She reread numerous books, tried to behave with Zach as recommended by intelligent people. Not to blame, not to argue, to explain her position, to talk to her husband about her feelings. But he continued to drink, a little at a time, a couple of bottles of beer in the evenings when he came home from work, and a bit more on weekends. He thought it was nothing. That's what everyone he talked to did. That's what was accepted. But it scared Carol. She was sure it wouldn't stop at just beer. Besides, she found out that Zach's father also drank. When the young woman was 7 months pregnant, she started bleeding. It began after a fight with Zach, when her husband drank more than usual. She was nervous, didn't sleep all night, and then went on duty and lost consciousness in the nursing station. Zach was scared. He swore to his wife that he wouldn't drink anymore, kissed Carol, reassured her that he adored both her and their future baby, and she believed him. It all turned out, as Carol's attending physician said, to be a mild scare. The pregnancy was successfully maintained, and soon Nick was born. Plump, extraordinarily cute, with huge blue eyes. He seemed to Carol like an angel. Like all young mothers, she could gaze at him for hours. She caught every movement, every expression on his round face, every sound he made. With her new responsibilities, she coped surprisingly well. Carol didn't expect to enjoy motherhood as much as she did. And who said it was hard? So what if he cries at night? But he's so sweet when he falls asleep. She didn't even get tired, fortunately. She was used to not sleeping during shifts and now contented herself with a few hours of daytime sleep. Zach, on the other hand, seemed to have come to his senses, stopped drinking his favorite beer, and helped with the baby. Only Mrs. Bailey was dissatisfied, neither with the birth of her grandson nor with Carol. She said that taking care of a baby was not a man's job. Carol accidentally overheard a conversation between her husband and her mother-in-law. "Zach, what's this all about? Where have you ever seen a guy changing diapers?" "Mom, what's wrong with that?" Zach was surprised. "It's not hard for me. It's my child, too. Carol needs to rest." "Your dad never helped me, Zach. I managed everything myself somehow, because I understood that this is women's work, not men's. Your job is to bring money into the house, and her job is to deal with the child. That's how it's always been, and that's right. But the conversation with his mother didn't affect Zach. He continued to help his wife, and she even began to think that all the most difficult parts of their relationship were behind them. She wasn't mistaken. He's a good husband and an excellent father, and he's proud of his son, the firstborn, the heir. Zach loved to speculate about teaching Nick to play football, how they would go on long hikes, how he would teach him to fix sockets. And Carol found it endearing. It's still good that a boy was born. No, she didn't care at all, as long as the baby was healthy. But for some men, it's terribly important. Maybe Herzek wasn't one of them. Then something terrible was discovered. At first, Carol noticed that Nick was not gaining weight well. He lagged behind growth charts, as if he was developing slower than he should, although he ate well. He was skinny, pale, almost translucent. At first, the doctor said that Carol was just overly anxious, that her son was developing normally. But then they sent Nick for examination, and they found a heart defect, a serious one, requiring surgical treatment in the future. Most likely, when Nick grows up, he'll need a pacemaker. But for now, no stress. Special diet. Carol was able to handle and accept this news, but Zach couldn't. It seemed like all his dreams about hikes and football were shattered, and he lost interest in his son. Carol felt like he now saw Nick as a defective product, something flawed that could just be thrown away and forgotten forever. He no longer approached the crib, didn't feed the baby from the bottle, or changed his diapers, saying he was afraid of accidentally harming Nick. But Carol understood that it was something else. Such a child simply wasn't needed by him, apparently. And Zach started drinking again. At first a little, and then more and more. By the time Nick turned 1, Zach was already having binges, and Mrs. Bailey blamed Carol for this. She often said that Carol must have done something during pregnancy. That's why a sick child was born. Perhaps she drank secretly or took some pills that pregnant women shouldn't take. Well, I have a son. He was born healthy, and no one in the family was sick, she reasoned, watching Carol rocking Nick. What could have caused such a thing, tell me? Well, you see, these things happen. It's nature, like a sort of lottery, Carol explained. This heart defect isn't hereditary. The heart just developed incorrectly, and that's what happened. No, there are no accidents, Mrs. Bailey frowned. I think it's all about your heredity. Both your mother and father drank. Carol wanted to say that according to Mrs. Bailey, Zach's father also drank, but she held herself back. Of course, they couldn't send little Nick to daycare. He might get sick. They had to make sure he didn't run around too much, ate on time, and took his medicine. That's why Carol couldn't go to work, and it annoyed Mrs. Bailey even more. She was sure Carol deliberately gave birth to a sick child just to stay home and do nothing. Zach didn't argue when his mother started these conversations, without even trying to defend his Carol, and the young woman felt like she was in an impossible situation. Sometimes she even wanted to go to Mrs. Adams, but that was a last resort, just in case. We have to endure it. Zach promised that he would save up for a new apartment, or rather for the down payment on the first mortgage. And then a new, calmer life will begin. We just have to endure a little. It will be easier later. 5 years passed. Carol tried to combat her husband's addiction. It seemed like she was even getting through to him, but her mother-in-law would go to the store herself and buy beer, offering it to her son in the evenings when he came home from work. And this woman argued that her son needed to relax. But how can you relax when there's a sick child at home and a wife who only asks for help? Carol firmly decided to go to Mrs. Adams. It would be calmer there. She didn't object. She had been alone all her life, never started a family, never had children. She saw Carol as her own daughter, and she assured her that Carol would find a job in Allentown. There was a small hospital there, more like a clinic. Carol, we have fresh air here. Nick will benefit, and the food is better than in the city, the woman said over the phone. I will help. I will gladly take care of your Nick. You know I love children. And then we'll arrange the surgery for him, and everything will be fine. But Carol couldn't go to her. She realized she was pregnant again. Again, the fatigue. Again, the desire to eat everything in sight. Again, the tests. And again, positive results. When Mrs. Bailey found out about the second pregnancy, she caused a scandal. "What are you doing? I knew that you were just looking for an opportunity to cling to the city, gave birth to one sick child. Want another one like him, huh?" Carol wanted to leave home, but she didn't. Zach persuaded her to stay, assured her that he would quit drinking for good, that he would love the children, that he would save up for the apartment, and his wife believed him because she wanted to believe it so badly. Sally was born. Mrs. Bailey found this name ridiculous, but Carol couldn't be persuaded otherwise. Her daughter seemed to her the most adorable in the world. How much she resembled Nick. The same blue eyes and round face, just like her brothers. Zach got his act together again. He worked hard, saved money for the apartment. But his mother, Mrs. Bailey, seemed to snap. She seemed to have finally hated Carol and tried to turn her life into hell. When Zach went to work, she started accusing Carol of all mortal sins. She lived at someone else's expense, took over their apartment with her degenerates. And maybe she didn't even give birth to them from Zach. Everyone in their family is healthy, but Nick has a heart defect, and the children don't even look like Zach. 4 more years passed. Zach drank, but he saved money for the apartment. Carol hoped that when they moved, he would finally quit drinking. At the very least, the beer would disappear from the fridge. And then the vodka. These items were diligently purchased for her son by Mrs. Bailey. Sometimes Carol poured them down the toilet, but it didn't bring any results, Zach argued. Mrs. Bailey ran to the store to help her son relax and unwind. There would be none of that in their own apartment. When Sally turned 4, Mrs. Adams passed away, and Carol found out that she had left her apartment to her in her will. That's when Carol's plan matured. Yes, her apartment was cheap, but if she sold it, added the money Zach had been saving, it would be enough for a down payment. They could move, and the nightmare would end. Yes, Mrs. Bailey wouldn't disappear. She would come over and annoy Carol. But better she come once a week than buy alcohol for her son every day. Carol told her husband about her plan one evening before bed, when they were lying in bed. Zach was silent. The woman got scared. "Darling, what's wrong? Don't you want to?" she asked. "Well, how do I say this, Carol? We don't have much money," Zach hesitated. "You've been saving for several years already," she exclaimed. "It should be enough." "Well, you see, the thing is, I recently lent money to a friend," Zach hesitated. "He wanted to buy a car. Well, how can you not help a friend?" "And did you give it to him?" she asked, alarmed. "Well, yes, of course." Zach sat up and looked down at his wife. "Women wouldn't understand. Male friendship is sacred." "And when will he return the money?" Carol asked. "As soon as he can, he'll pay it back," Zach frowned. "And when did you give him the money?" "A year ago," her husband replied. "And you didn't tell me?" Carol protested. "Do you think it's normal? Are we going to keep living like this, in a house where you're served drinks every day and you can't say no? Is that normal?" "If you don't like something, then leave," Zach suddenly shouted, "and take your kids with you. Mom told me a long time ago that they have nothing to do with me, nothing at all. And I see it myself. They're not mine. I would feel something if they were mine. Instincts would awaken." Carol then jumped out of bed. "Oh, your instincts didn't awaken. Maybe they would have if you weren't getting drunk every day." "What?" Zach also stood up and slowly approached Carol, who was barely breathing with fear. He looked menacing, fists clenched, eyes shining. Carol had never seen him like this before. That night, Zach hit her for the first time. He slapped her, so hard that Carol flew against the wall. She could doubt many things, could believe that Zach would change, could wait for a miracle. But one thing the young woman knew for sure. If a man raised his hand against you, you couldn't stay with him. Carol gathered her things and took the children the same night. No one tried to stop her. Mrs. Bailey looked at her with a triumphant smile. Yes, she had won, and Carol had lost. They spent the night in a hostel. The woman had a little money on her card. She tried not to spend the child benefits. Nick kept asking why they were leaving, and his mom told the little one they were moving. "And what about Dad?" "Dad's staying," Carol said. "We, son, decided to live separately. "I'm sorry, but it has to be this way." Nick reacted with strange calmness. It had to be this way. The boy knew how to accept life as it was. "I can't run. Well, then I'll read a book. Can't go to gym class? I'll have more time to prepare for the next lesson," Nick reasoned aloud. And Carol envied her son a little, a rare quality. It would help him in life. Sally, on the other hand, seemed not to understand what was happening. She pouted a little and then calmed down. The next day, the train was already taking them to Allentown. Carol tried not to cry in front of the children. Mom should always be cheerful, calm, confident, and she would have time to cry when she was alone. So Carol found herself in her hometown of Allentown, in a small apartment where Mrs. Adams used to live. There was enough money for a modest renovation. Carol bought folding sofas for the children, re-glued the wallpaper. Nick was delighted with the library. Carol herself lovingly sorted through the books, ones she had known since childhood. Once she read them in the light of a yellow lampshade, and now her adult son reads them. She had to look for a job. It was good that Carol moved at the beginning of the summer. There was plenty of time to sort out school for her son, a kindergarten for Sally, and then start looking for a job. The woman hoped there would be vacancies at the hospital, but Alice, there were none. She was promised that they would call as soon as a position became available. Carol had to get a job at a confectionery factory that had recently opened in Allentown. She worked as a packer. She was trained quickly. The job was simple, albeit monotonous. But the woman was grateful even for this. The main thing was to have money. Luckily, the groceries in Allentown were cheap. Local farmers traded here. You could buy fruits, vegetables, meat, and milk. It was okay. She just had to endure a little. They would pay much more at the hospital, and then, who knows, maybe she would be able to buy a house with her own plot of land. Carol dreamed of having her own little garden where she could tinker with the kids, grow strawberries. But for now, she had to settle for less, and Carol didn't complain to anyone, not even to herself. There's an apartment, and that's something to be grateful for. Thank you, Mrs. Adams. There's a job. The rest will fall into place. Zach readily agreed to the divorce. True, the alimony he paid was meager. Carol decided not to sue him. She didn't want to see him and his mother any more than necessary. She lived calmly and quietly, though she was often tired. But she could live with that. Nick picked up his younger sister Sally from daycare, went to school on his own. Carol's kids were quite independent. They could tidy up the house themselves and prepare a simple lunch and dinner. And Carol liked her neighbors. She knew many of them from childhood, but this new one, Jordan, stirred up almost a feeling of hatred in her. An alcoholic. He'd get drunk and lie unconscious right on the stairs. He probably managed to ruin many lives. Carol was sure his wife kicked him out of the house. Now he lives alone. Jordan seemed to work at a furniture factory. Sometimes she saw him sober, like when he was going to work, for example. He must realize he needs to hold on to his job to make a living. But when he had days off, he'd drink until he passed out and didn't always have the strength to make it to his apartment. True, he had enough sense to make it home. But more often than not, Jordan drank at his place. Fortunately, he was quiet, didn't gather any company or make noise. But Carol still felt disgusted seeing him. A young man about 45 years old, and he traded a normal life for alcohol, just like her parents did once. Carol realized she didn't consider alcoholics to be human beings at all. After all, no one pours alcohol into their mouths. It's solely their choice. And the neighbors too. Carol had noticed more than once that Jordan was being taken care of. They brought him soups, mashed potatoes with cutlets, and he shamelessly accepted it. True, when he was sober, he helped the neighbors, fixing their sockets or replacing light bulbs. They seemed to like him for some reason, and Carol didn't understand why. But Carol felt no sympathy for Jordan. The sooner he moved out, the better it would be in the hallway. She wouldn't have to step over his lifeless, drunken body on her way home from work. And here he is today, lying down, resting. He knows that kind people will wake him up, and they'll even tuck him into bed. But Carol wasn't a kind person. At least her kindness didn't extend to people like Jordan. The next day, she woke up early, woke the kids up, fed them omelets. She got out the skis. Carol bought them at the beginning of winter, persuaded by Sally. Just for her and her daughter, Nick couldn't ski yet, but they could go for a walk in the fresh air. The three of them headed into the woods. They went ski, drank tea from a thermos, and played in the snow. On such days, the woman felt absolutely happy. I wonder, does Zach even understand what he's missing out on? He doesn't communicate with the kids, doesn't call, and certainly doesn't visit them. Forgot about them right after the divorce. Probably thinks he's got enough of the elements to be a good father. They returned home at 6 in the evening. Carol fed the children, checked Nick's blood pressure. Thankfully, it was normal. "Mom, when's the surgery?" Nick asked as his mother was putting away the blood pressure monitor. "Nick, I don't know. You heard for yourself last time we went to the hospital. Maybe in 4 years." "And then will I be able to ski too?" he asked. You will, sweetheart," his mom smiled. Of course, he wants to be like everyone else. Run, sled, ski, skate, play soccer. But for now, it's impossible. Nick has become so thin, pale. Whether it's because of the illness or because he's always on his computer. "I'm not a sweetheart," Nick objected. "I'm practically an adult already." "Oh, okay, practically almost an adult, sorry," and Carol tousled her son's hair. "Go see what Sally's doing. She's quiet again. Probably making her art on the wallpaper again. And I'll wash the dishes and start making soup for tomorrow." But Carol only managed to wash the dishes. There was a knock on the door. She wasn't expecting any guests, so she got worried. Who knows what could have happened? She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the hallway. "Who's there?" "Please open up, it's your neighbor." Carol recognized the voice. It was the same woman who helped Jordan get home yesterday. She opened the door. The neighbor was still wearing her robe, though now she had rollers in her hair. "Hello, I'm Betsy." The woman looked at Carol with concern. "You're a nurse, right? Tamala said you were studying at college, I think." The apartment owner didn't immediately understand who Tamala was talking about. Mrs. Adams, right. Apparently, she and Betsy were close. "Yes, I'm a nurse. What about it?" Carol asked. "Oh, I'm sorry for barging in like this. Jordan seems to be in bad shape. His face is bruised. Can you take a look?" Carol frowned. She wished someone would help her as eagerly and enthusiastically as everyone in the house dealt with this Jordan. "I really don't want to, honestly. He'll sleep it off and everything will be fine. He probably just fell. That happens often with alcoholics." "Carol, I'm begging you, just check on him, please. I'm really worried." She wanted to refuse. But still, Carol, being a medic, had to help everyone in need, regardless of her views on life and her relationship with them. "Okay, just a moment," she sighed. "Let me grab everything I need." She went into the bathroom. There in the cabinet was a plastic container, an emergency kit. "All right, bandages, adhesive strips, that should be enough. There's probably nothing serious there, just a couple of scrapes, I guess." And Betsy decided to play the Good Samaritan. "What's next? Do I have to check everyone's blood pressure in the entire building at any time of day or night, or what?" Carol firmly knew that when you move into a new house, your neighbors shouldn't know you're a medic. She came out into the corridor, took off her apron, and hung it on the rack. "I'm ready." "Let's go quickly, thank you. Tamala said you have a kind heart." They descended to the 4th floor where Jordan lived. "I found him by the door, covered in bruises. It's a nightmare. What if he has a concussion?" Betsy fretted. "Well, I thought I'd come to you, to Tamala's girl. She'll definitely help." "I'll help," the woman agreed grimly. "Is his door open?" Of course it's open." Betsy pushed the door. "Come in," she urged. "He's in the living room lying down." Carol looked around. Strange. Usually in the apartments of alcoholics, there's disorder. They have other interests, not cleaning. But here it was as if a woman lived. And a rather tidy one. No dust, on the dresser near the mirror, a bouquet of artificial flowers in a blue glass vase. Next to it, a plush bunny. Carol walked into the living room. Jordan was lying on the couch, not making a sound. There were toys on the shelves too. Rabbits, bears, a doll with white hair and a pink dress. Sally had the same doll. Expensive. Carol really didn't want to buy it, but her daughter begged so much that she had to. And there were children's drawings on the wall, just 3 of them. One was a house surrounded by trees. The second was a seascape. Waves and a sailboat with sails. and the sun in the corner with long yellow rays. And on the third drawing, there was a crudely drawn car. Nick drew like that when he was 6. He's much better now. Carol looked at Betsy in bewilderment. "Well, take a look, please," the neighbor pleaded. The young woman approached Jordan hesitantly. His eyes were closed with a few bruises on his face. Apparently, he fell right on the pavement. Carol took out everything she had brought with her. "I won't wake him," she whispered. "I'll clean and bandage the wounds." "But what if he has a concussion?" Betsy asked, frightened. "I wouldn't be able to tell anyway. He's drunk as far as I understand," Carol sighed. "I hate to suggest this, but I'll have to." She turned to Betsy. "Tomorrow, if you see him, tell him to come over to me in the evening. I'll check for symptoms, and if necessary, we'll send him to the hospital." "All right, you know best," the neighbor nodded. Carol put on latex gloves, quickly treated the wounds, and carefully covered them with adhesive strips. It's unlikely there's a concussion. The bruises are shallow. Then she cautiously placed her palms under his occiput. It seemed clean, no bruising. Everything was fine. He was breathing evenly. His eyes were darting under his eyelids. He was probably dreaming. And then his eyes opened suddenly. He looked straight at Carol. His eyes were light gray with a dark rim around the edges, even beautiful. If Carol didn't know he was an alcoholic, her heart might have skipped a beat. "Tiffany?" Jordan asked softly. "Not Tiffany," Betsy sighed. "This is Carol, a neighbor who moved in recently." "Tiffany." He squinted, and then somewhat disappointedly averted his gaze, closed his eyes again, and breathed evenly as before. Carol stood up. "I'm done. Let him come by tomorrow. And who is this Tiffany?" "Oh, Carol, it's such a terrible story," Betsy exclaimed, raising her hands. "Come to my place. I'll tell you if you want. Jordan doesn't really hide it, and everyone knows anyway. You just arrived recently, so they haven't had a chance to tell you." At first, Carol thought of declining. She was absolutely uninterested in what happened to this Jordan. But curiosity won. After hesitating for a moment, she nodded. "All right, let's go. I'll just stop by home and tell the kids I'm going out." "I'll be waiting for you, apartment 12, Betsy replied cheerfully. 5 minutes later, Carol was at Betsy's place. "Do you want some tea?" she asked. "I have a good one. My son brings it from India." "From India?" Carol was surprised. "Yes," the neighbor proudly smiled. "He's a scientist, studying the culture of that country. He's loved it since childhood, since I bought him a collection of myths about India." "Well, if that's the case, then I'll give it a try," Carol nodded. Betsy poured her guest a cup of exceptionally aromatic tea. She took a small sip. The rich, intense flavor like this you probably couldn't buy in a store. "So, about our Jordan," Betsy sat opposite Carol. "He came to Allentown 2 years ago, but the first time I found him in the hallway, I felt sorry for him. Brought him to my place, put him to sleep. He told me his whole life that night. We talked all night. Poor thing had so much bottled up inside, and he's a good guy, a really good one. But, Carol, he's got an unhappy fate. That's why he drinks, trying to forget." "What could possibly happen to make someone drink like that?" Carol burst out. "Why do some people cope with their sorrow, while others completely lose their humanity?" "You should listen first," the woman sighed, "and then judge. You need to know what's weighing on a person's soul, what path they've walked, understand?" Jordan grew up in a small town, in a good family. His parents were both teachers at the school. His dad taught physics, and his mom literature. Jordan did well in school, played football, made his parents proud with his achievements, and even as a teenager, he didn't cause them any grief. He had a dream of becoming an artist. He drew exceptionally well, with pencils, paints, and even ink and pen. There seemed to be no technique he couldn't master. He loved wandering around town, sketching from life, and he also drew funny caricatures of the school teachers. For this reason, one time his mom was summoned to the principal's office. Jordan drew a caricature of the gym teacher, which the teacher found in the locker room and was deeply offended. Of course, everyone knew who could have drawn such a caricature. Only Jordan could capture someone's features so accurately and amusingly on paper. The principal didn't scold him, just asked Jordan not to spread his works around. After finishing school, Jordan easily got into art college. He didn't ask his parents for money. His paintings sold well, although he rarely had the chance to paint for himself. He mostly created still lifes, landscapes, and sometimes painted portraits from life. During one of the classes, they had to draw a person, and a new model arrived. Seeing her, Jordan was amazed. She was beautiful. He had never seen a girl more beautiful. Long, light hair, huge eyes as blue as the sea, and thin lips. They made her face somehow childlike and vulnerable. The girl shyly took off her robe, sat down on a chair, and froze in the sunlight streaming in from the open window. A light breeze gently tousled her hair, shining like real gold. Jordan almost forgot that he was supposed to be drawing. He kept staring at her until his classmate nudged Jordan in the side. "What's the matter with you? Wake up, are you going to draw?" Jordan shook his head. "What?" "Nothing," his friend teased. "Just make at least a sketch. What are you going to submit?" And Jordan began the drawing. Actually, he didn't draw the figure as required, but a portrait. He just couldn't bring himself to look at her body, and he felt like he was grieving her with his gaze alone, and she seemed to shrink, her cheeks blushed, her eyes downcast. So he drew her, youthful, embarrassed, resembling a nymph. The class came to an end. Jordan waited for the model to get dressed and approached her. "Hi," he smiled. "Hello." The girl blushed even more. "It's your first time, right?" "Yes, is it obvious?" She sighed. "I really didn't want to, but I needed the money. And if you undress, they pay more. I'll never do it again. I thought I'd die." "Oh, come on," Jordan shrugged. "We're artists. It's like doctors. We look without any of that. And what's your name?" "Tiffany," she replied, extending her tiny hand. "And yours?" "Jordan." "And show me what you've drawn," she asked. "I'm curious." "I'll show you, but in exchange you'll let me walk you home." Jordan nodded. "Okay." She laughed, and Jordan thought he heard the tinkling of silver bells. That day he fell in love. In love once and for all. Apparently Jordan was monogamous by nature, like his father. His dad also saw Jordan's future mother at the bus stop and realized that she was his destiny. He approached her to introduce himself and never parted from her again. So Jordan was the same. He realized that Tiffany was his other half as soon as she entered the classroom. It turned out she was studying to be a pastry chef. She grew up in an orphanage. Tiffany didn't remember her parents. She had an elderly grandmother whom she often visited on weekends. Tiffany couldn't live with her permanently. Her grandmother lived too far away, and Tiffany would have to spend 4 hours a day commuting. She decided to work as a model on the advice of a classmate who sometimes did the same. Jordan mentally thanked Tiffany's classmate who gave her such advice. If it weren't for her, it was scary to imagine, although he believed that they would have met anyway. You can't escape fate after all. He almost immediately confessed his love to her on their third date. Tiffany laughed at this. "How fast? You don't even know me well. What if I'm a cunning woman looking for a rich man? Or maybe I change boyfriends and plan to break your heart." "I don't care," Jordan replied then. "I love you anyway, and there's nothing I can do about it." They moved in together. Jordan had enough money to rent an apartment, and when he finished his studies, they got married. Jordan quickly became a successful artist. He rented a studio and painted portraits from life. Clients lined up to see him. He knew how to perfectly capture the essence of a person on canvas, not just making them beautiful, but showing the best of what was in them. But of course, his favorite model was Tiffany. He painted her thoughtful, sitting with a book or knitting a scarf, even sleeping. He couldn't get enough of her. She seemed to him the most beautiful creature in the world. Sometimes Jordan even felt like he was going crazy. That's how much he loved her. And he was grateful to the universe for giving them the opportunity to meet and be together. Tiffany worked in a cafe baking pastries and dreamed of opening her own bakery. Jordan promised her that her dream would come true and saved money, which he planned to give Tiffany as startup capital, and he also saved up for an apartment. 2 years later, they bought an apartment. Tiffany got pregnant. Soon their daughter Daisy was born, and a year later, their son Harry was born. Jordan dreamed of having more children, but he worried about Tiffany. He knew it was hard to handle 2 children, but she wanted there to be a small age difference between the children. "It's easier," she said. "They'll grow up and keep each other occupied, become friends. But when the age difference is big, it's harder to communicate. The next few years were the happiest in Jordan's life. It seemed like fate had given them everything they could ever want. A beloved family, a cherished job, money. What else could one dream of? Tiffany often mentioned wanting a country house. Jordan bought one. It was small but with a nice plot of land. If they saved up enough money, they could renovate the house to accommodate everyone. They planned to have more children, at least 2 more. Tiffany often went to the house with the kids while Jordan worked. She enjoyed living in the countryside, loved taking walks with Daisy and Harry. She went on that fateful summer trip. Daisy was already 10 years old, Harry 8. Jordan would always remember how they gathered, how the children excitedly ran around the house, stuffing rubber rings into a bag. They loved swimming in the lake, which was a kilometer away from the house. And Jordan had to finish a portrait and join his family in just 2 days. As always, Tiffany kissed her husband goodbye. "Just don't get carried away, Jordan. You promised to come, and we'll be waiting for you." "I'll definitely come. I love you." He hugged her. "Work, just a little left, dear." Those were the last words he said to Tiffany. The next morning, an unfamiliar man called him, introduced himself as a police officer, and informed him that their house had burned down. Tiffany and the children were no more. "It was cold at night, probably turned on the heater," he said over the phone. "The wiring caught fire. They didn't even leave the house, went in their sleep. Don't worry, they didn't suffer." Jordan remembered those words, just like the day Tiffany was leaving for the trip. Don't worry, they didn't suffer. It was all he could hold on to. At least they didn't suffer. He couldn't recall the next 6 months. There must have been funerals, there had to be. But Jordan felt like they were just dreams. 3 closed coffins, silence, broken only by the too loud singing of birds. And why were there birds in the cemetery at all? Pain, immense pain, greater than himself. It was unbearable. Art couldn't help him forget. Jordan even lost the ability to draw altogether. He'd pick up a brush and stare at a blank canvas, not understanding how he ever managed to depict anything. It was as if he had never seen colors before. Everything suddenly turned gray. The whole world and its palettes lost their vibrancy and stopped bringing joy. Then the man started drinking. For the first time, he opened a bottle of vodka at his family's grave and drank. He had never drunk before. He felt very bad. It seems he even lost consciousness then. And then he felt calm. Not good, but calm. But it was better than that strange state he had lived in before. There was no pain inside, which Jordan was incapable of enduring. And he started drinking regularly. He sold all his works, brushes, and canvases, sold the house, bought an apartment in Allentown. He just found the first ad for housing that he could afford. He got a job at a furniture factory. The pain returned almost every day. He either worked or remembered, and those memories tore Jordan's chest apart. He took extra shifts to distract himself, but still couldn't spend all his days and nights at the factory. He had to drink. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to live on. He would do something to himself, follow his family. Jordan was a man of faith. He knew that voluntarily leaving life was a grave sin. But Tiffany and the children were now in heaven. If he ended up in hell, he wouldn't be able to see them ever again. So all he could do was wait. He waited. Sooner or later, it would happen. And one day, he would embrace his family. Even if it was in the afterlife, in that place where no one had returned from yet. "So, Carol, don't judge him like that," Betsy concluded. "He's a good person, just lost everything he loved, stuck between life and death like he's trying to catch up with his loved ones but can't. And he will catch up someday if a miracle doesn't happen." "Oh my God," Carol whispered. She genuinely felt sorry for Jordan. Most of all, she feared losing her children. Just the thought of something happening to them made Carol feel sick. Yes, she sometimes thought about it. What if Nick or Sally died? She understood that she would have to go on living for the sake of her second child. She believed she would find the strength to do so, but only half of her would remain. Her heart would be torn in 2, one part dying with her son or daughter. It turns out, both halves of Jordan died when his family was gone. So, the poor man lived without a heart, filling the void with alcohol. "Yeah, that's how it goes," sighed Betsy. Have you seen how many toys there are? He only kept the toys and some photographs, but he can't look at them, says it hurts too much. He brought that album but couldn't bring himself to open it. Carol came home utterly devastated. She felt ashamed. Ashamed that she had hated Jordan, despised him, denied him the right to be considered human. Now, all that was left was sympathy. A sympathy so deep as if Carol herself had endured this monstrous tragedy with him. The next day was her day off. She worked for 2 days, then had 2 days off. Not the best schedule, but she hadn't been able to find anything else yet. In the morning, the woman woke the children up. Sally had a fever. Oh, what kind of mother was she? She hadn't paid attention. Oh, you, Carol sighed, taking the thermometer from under Sally's armpit. Come on, admit it. You went out without a scarf again yesterday? Just a little, Sally sighed, lowering her gaze. There was a knock on the door. Nick, please open the door, the woman called out. I'll put on my robe for now. Carol was still in her pajamas. On her day off, she liked to wear them all day. I wonder who's at the door. Mom, it's for you. Nick peeked into the room. Some man came. She immediately recognized who it was. Carol quickly threw on her robe and peeked into the hallway. It was Jordan, unshaven, but looking fresher, with a plaster on his face. He was dressed in a clean t-shirt and jeans. How could he not be cold? Maybe he was used to it already. How many times had he ended up there, drunk? Carol got annoyed with herself. Stop thinking like that about him. First, walk a mile in someone's shoes, and then draw conclusions. Hello, Jordan said, embarrassed. Betsy told me you came by yesterday. I wanted to thank you, but I don't know how, honestly. Oh, please, Carol replied. You don't need to thank me, it cost me nothing. Well, you know, if you need anything, you can ask me. I can fix an outlet, for example, or something else. My dad taught me, well, when I'm in a sober state, of course. Thanks, the outlets are fine, Carol shook her head. No need to worry. She felt herself blushing. Betsy shouldn't have told her all this. Perhaps you'll join us for breakfast. We just got up, it's my day off, so it's not quite breakfast, she said. I made some soup recently. Let's eat. Soup? He asked again. I love soup. Sally peeked into the hallway. Hello, the girl said loudly. My name is Sally. Jordan's gaze darkened for a moment. Carol was terrified to imagine what was happening in his soul right now. Meet, she smiled. This is my daughter, Sally, and you've already met my son, Nick. Yes, you have lovely children, Jordan rubbed his forehead with his hand. It must be really hard for him right now. His movements were abrupt, jerky. He must have remembered his own. Let's go, she touched his hand. Yes, let's go, Sally jumped. Mom, do you know how she cooks? 100 times tastier than Grandma, and 1,000 times tastier than... The girl paused, not knowing how to finish the sentence. Jordan laughed. Oh, if it's that delicious, I can't refuse. They walked into the kitchen. Carol heated up the soup and served it into bowls. On the fridge hung a drawing by Sally, some unknown creature surrounded by huge bright flowers. The creature had 5 green eyes and drooping, furry ears. Oh, beautiful, the man remarked. Did you draw this, Sally? Of course, the girl proudly replied. She's just an artist, Nick said, and Sally's best at wallpaper art. Silly, Sally playfully slapped her brother's shoulder. Nick stuck his tongue out at his sister. Especially in the corner of our room. Who did that? Me? He asked. Those are mice, Sally said. They take pencils and draw pictures at night. Jordan laughed. Mice, you see. I used to have my own studio, and mice would come at night, take paints and brushes, and paint on little canvases for their mouse babies. Wow, Sally's eyes sparkled. Will you show us? Well, I can show you some things I've kept, the guest replied. But I don't know when. I lost a lot during the move. But mice are really good at drawing. Can you imagine how they hold the brushes? How? How do they hold them? Sally squirmed in her seat with impatience. By their tails, Jordan said. Can you imagine? It was clear that the man enjoyed talking to the kids, but Carol noticed a sad contemplation in his eyes. Perhaps he was seeing his own Daisy and Harry right now, and yet he kept it together. Just hope he won't run for vodka today. Otherwise, it will end up being her fault. Zach had never spoken to the children like that before. He never admired little Nick's drawings, never told any funny stories that only children believe in, or don't believe at all, but just enjoy the flight of imagination. I wonder how Zach is doing. He probably found another woman by now. Maybe she'll turn out to be better than Carol. Maybe with her, he'll quit drinking. She felt sad. What was happening to her? Jordan finished his meal, complimented Carol, saying he had never tasted a soup as delicious, and went to his apartment. "Mom, is he our neighbor?" Nick asked. "You know, the one who drinks a lot." "Yes, that's him," Carol answered thoughtfully. "But he doesn't look like an alcoholic," the boy said. Mom, what's an alcoholic?" Sally asked. "Oops, a cookie fell into my cup, Mom." "Oh my goodness, how many times have I asked you not to do that?" Carol sighed. "Let me pour you a fresh one. An alcoholic it's a person who drinks because they don't know how to deal with their problems, but it's very bad because there's always a solution, and drinking is not it." Carol stopped herself. What solution did Jordan have, just to stop feeling? After that day, Jordan started to come by sometimes, when he was sober, of course. He still drank, but Carol felt he did it much less often. At least she hadn't seen him in the hallway anymore. A month later, Carol was offered a job at the hospital. She happily quit her job at the confectionery factory and returned to her beloved and familiar duties. There was only one therapeutic department in the hospital. There were 2 doctors and 3 nurses working there. Now Carol worked on a schedule of every other day. Nick could safely stay with his sister. He was old enough to handle Sally. But just in case, Carol made a duplicate of the keys for Betsy and arranged with her neighbor that Nick could come to her and ask for help if necessary. You never know what might happen while she's at work. Carol was grateful for mobile phones. It's good that now you can be in touch at any moment, call her son, and make sure everything's okay at home. The woman befriended one of the nurses. Her name was Angela. She had been working at the hospital for 10 years. She filled Carol in on the details. "So basically, if everything's simple and easy, we handle it here. If it's a complicated case, we transport them to the city," she said, on the day Carol started working. "We go out occasionally if someone needs injections or IV drips. We have our own car and a driver, so you won't have to do anything difficult. You'll get the hang of it. We have more paperwork than actual patient interaction." The job wasn't complicated. Carol knew how to administer IV drips and injections. Gradually, all the regular patients, mostly elderly women suffering from angina or heart failure, heard about Carol, who was the best at giving injections, and they demanded only her. Carol drove around the Allentown area, enjoying the beauty of the local landscapes. Sometimes a thought crossed her mind. Maybe she should ask Jordan to draw something for her? After all, wherever you looked, there was a ready-made painting. Forest, clearings, cute, well-kept houses, a lake. But Carol couldn't bring herself to ask. Jordan didn't realize that she knew the story of his life. Maybe he would feel awkward. A stranger being aware of his losses, his pain. But they had become friends. No, Carol didn't see him as a man, let alone a potential husband. She was still afraid of drinkers. But for some reason, she felt good around him. And her children had completely taken to this neighbor, as if he were family. Sally always demanded that Jordan tell her stories about how mice draw, and Nick seemed to like him. They discussed cars and even video games. It turned out that in his previous life, Jordan enjoyed playing games on a console. Probably played with his son. But Carol tried to push that thought away. It wasn't her concern. One day, Jordan came over for a visit just to have tea like neighbors do. Sally greeted him joyfully as always and dragged him into the kitchen before he could even gather his thoughts. Nick and Carol exchanged glances. "She's hanging on him like a monkey," Nick observed. "And he's okay with it," Carol laughed. "Come on, Nick, before she starts bossing him around in there. I've had enough of her watercolor tea." They sat down at the table. Carol had just baked cookies. "I actually followed the smell," Jordan declared. "I could smell it from my apartment." "Yeah, smells delicious, Mom," Sally nodded. "Oh, by the way, Jordan, tell us about the mice." "About the mouse?" The man smiled. "Well, the other day I went into town, bought some small canvases and paints, and of course a little brush. I called the mice from my workshop, and you know what? They agreed to come for a short visit. Here, take a look. The neighbor pulled a small canvas out of his pocket. On it was depicted a little mouse, funny, with a pink nose, in a dress and a wreath of white daisies. Wow, exclaimed Sally. How cool. Will the mice give me this painting? Sweetheart, it's not nice to demand gifts, Carol told her. She wanted to be strict but couldn't hide her smile. Oh, it's nothing, Jordan winked at the woman. I don't think the mice would mind. Here, Sally, take it. I'll hang it over my bed, Mom, can I? Will you drill the wall? You see? As soon as something comes up, you're asked to bring out the drill. Carol smiled. Well, of course, I'll drill. Otherwise, you'll drill into my head, won't you? Yeah, the girl nodded. Thanks, mice. Will you tell them? Carol suddenly felt sad, and they're now like a real family. The children laugh, Jordan smiles, talks to them with pleasure, and she, Carol the hostess, who baked delicious cookies for tea. Nobody's in a hurry. Everyone just enjoys the free day and each other's company. That's how it should be. And then she realized. Jordan, he started drawing again. Maybe it's not worth attaching so much importance to it. But for some reason, the sadness vanished in an instant. Something is changing for the better. Once she bumped into Jordan when returning home from the store with a heavy bag. He almost ran up to Carol and grabbed the bag. Hello. Can one carry such weights? Yeah. Oh, come on, I'm used to it. There's nothing heavy here. Just potatoes, milk, and odds and ends. That's how a whole bag full of odds and ends accumulates, he frowned. You need to take care of yourself. You have kids. Does their father help at all? Yeah, child support, Carol sighed, massaging her sore hand from the weight of the bag. That's all it comes down to. Just child support. Yeah, I never understood that, the man said thoughtfully. These are your kids, the greatest joy in life. Okay, sorry, I'm getting into things that aren't my business. By the way, can you come in for a minute? I want to show you something. Yeah, sure, she was surprised. What is it? You'll see, he smiled. It's important to me. I wanted to share it with you. She entered his apartment. Jordan placed the bag on the floor. Follow me. Carol was stunned as she entered the room. Near the window stood an easel. On it was a canvas depicting a cloudy sunset sky. The sun illuminated the sky, the colors shifting from pink to dark purple. Carol couldn't help but stare at the painting. How beautiful, she exclaimed. Thank you, he replied. He approached the painting and looked at it thoughtfully. There's still a lot of work to do here, but I haven't picked up a brush in many years and I just felt like... He trailed off. Betsy told me everything, Carol confessed. I'm sorry, I should have told you myself. Everything that I know. It's okay, he turned to her, squinting slightly. I would have told you myself. Betsy, she's a good woman. She feels sorry for me. I'm very grateful to her for that. I just wish there were no reasons to feel sorry. I just don't know how. Then, Jordan, it's great that you're painting again, Carol said sincerely. You're a real talent. Yeah, I used to be, he waved his hand. Now maybe I won't be able to, like before. And by the way, thank you. And what for? She asked. Just because, just for being there for your children. Jordan took a step towards her and stopped, as if he wanted to do something but changed his mind. Carol, I really enjoy talking to them, and to you too. It's like remembering mine. And it somehow becomes easier, you know. She returned home, where Nick was already waiting for her. Mom, why are you acting so strange? He asked from the doorway. How so? Why would you think that? Well, your eyes are sparkling, Mom, and your cheeks are red. Nick skeptically glanced at his mother. Are you in love or something? How dare you talk to your mother like that? Carol protested. Mom, that's your upbringing, Nick laughed. Carol grew even closer to Jordan, and it scared her. She realized that she was developing feelings for him and didn't know what to do about it. She knew for sure that there are no former alcoholics. She didn't want to repeat the path she had taken with her ex-husband and the memories of how her parents lived. No, maybe it's just a temporary phenomenon. It will pass. She hadn't had anyone for too long, and in her life there was only one love, Zach. And Carol once thought that this love would be the first and the last. Turns out she was wrong. Even Betsy noticed how they sometimes return at home together. The woman added fuel to the fire. She wore a cunning smile when they met and asked how Jordan was doing. Did she like him, Carol? These conversations made Carol want to disappear into the ground. She did like him, but she wouldn't do anything about it. Because he drank. Maybe now he was doing it secretly? Well, she wouldn't get involved with him for anything. Being friends? Sure, let's be friends. But nothing more. Carol decided to replace him with someone else. However, she couldn't find a suitable candidate, except maybe Fred, one of the doctors she worked with. He seemed to like her, and Fred was not married. He was only 35. Carol even went on a date with him, but with Fred, she wasn't just bored, it was simply nothing. Yes, he was nice, smart, kind, and the fact that Carol had 2 children from her previous marriage didn't scare him off. It's just that her heart didn't flutter for Fred, but with Jordan, it did. She just had to wait for this fluttering to stop, to fade away on its own. 2 months passed. Winter came, Carol's favorite time of year. Jordan seemed to have stopped drinking altogether. They didn't talk about it, but the man looked much better. He even started gaining weight. It turned out he, like Carol, enjoyed cooking. Sometimes he spoiled her and her children with dishes of his own making. Homemade pizza, for example, or meat with herb-roasted potatoes. On the eve of Christmas, Carol decided to go to the city to buy gifts for the children. Jordan offered to accompany her, and Carol agreed. They strolled through the festively decorated city, had coffee, went window shopping, and visited an art supply store. Jordan replenished his supplies of brushes, pencils, and canvases there. Carol bought her son a game disc he had long wanted and a new computer mouse. Sally asked for some strange soft toy in blue, which seemed to Carol like a nightmare incarnate. "Oh goodness, how awful," the woman said, taking the toy in her hands. "And why does she like it so much?" "Children often have their own peculiar ideas of beauty," Jordan smiled. "For example, my son used to adore some blue little men." "Oh, Smurfs?" Carol nodded. "We went through that phase too." For some reason, her heart suddenly felt unusually warm. It seemed like he talked about his children for the first time. Apparently, it really was getting easier for him. "Carol?" called a familiar voice. The woman turned around and saw her mother-in-law, Mrs. Bailey. She hurried toward them. Carol instinctively hunched her head into her shoulders. Seeing her was the last thing she wanted. Mrs. Bailey approached Carol and Jordan and unexpectedly hugged her. "My dear, I've missed you so much. How are you? How's your life?" she asked. "Not bad," Carol squeaked. "Just picking out gifts for the kids." "Oh, my grandchildren, I miss them terribly. And you don't call, you don't write," Mrs. Bailey said, seemingly not noticing Jordan. And Carol decided to rectify the situation. "This is my friend Jordan, a talented artist," she said. "Oh, a friend. Zach, my son, misses you, Carol. Regrets how things turned out. We often think of you. Maybe you two will reconcile, huh?" Mrs. Bailey said. "Sorry, we're in a hurry," Carol said. For some reason, she wanted to hide behind Jordan's back. Apparently, he sensed it with some invisible soul fibers and stepped forward, as if shielding her. "Oh, hurry then, but at least leave me your phone number. You changed it, you know. I've been calling and calling, couldn't get through to you," Mrs. Bailey insisted. "Yeah," Carol sighed. "All right, write it down." After saying goodbye to Mrs. Bailey, Carol and Jordan headed to the bus stop. They needed to catch the train so as not to be late. "Your mother-in-law?" the man asked. "Yeah, ex," Carol replied. "She seems like a nice woman," he said somewhat reluctantly. "I imagined her differently for some reason." "And how did you imagine her?" "Well, I don't know, like a witch probably," he smiled. "Because they hurt you." "No one hurt anyone," Carol bristled irritably. "It happens. We just didn't get along." "But 2 kids are reason to stay together." Carol felt angry. Why was he meddling in her life? "You see, he drank," she said, "and I can't live with an alcoholic. My parents drank too. I know what it's like. So I decided to raise my children alone, without him. So they wouldn't know what it's like to be afraid of the sound of a key turning in the lock, you know? When you don't know what state dad is in, whether he's kind or angry, sober or drunk." Jordan recoiled. He seemed to pale slightly but quickly composed himself. Although Carol already regretted her words, it must be very painful for him right now. And he had only just begun to thaw, and Carol wanted to slap herself across the face. "I understand," Jordan said. "It's really hard. I would never wish that upon your children or you." The light festive mood was gone in an instant. They rode home in silence. Carol stared tensely out the window while Jordan read a book, but they bid farewell warmly, and the woman hoped he wouldn't hold a grudge against her. The next day, she struggled to wake Nick up. "Sweetheart, we were supposed to go get the Christmas tree." Nick sat up, blinking sleepily. "Mom, can't we sleep a little longer?" Carol noticed the book lying next to the bed. "Nick, were you reading all night again?" "Well, it's very interesting, Mom. Learning about quantum mechanics for kids is fascinating. Maybe I should go to physics school. I'll look for new particles." "Oh, come on, you're my little particle. Stay in bed a bit longer. I'll make breakfast," the woman sighed. After breakfast, they planned to go for the Christmas tree. They were sold on the outskirts of Allentown, and they were cheap. Another plus of living in such a place was the prices for groceries and Christmas trees. Carol planned to choose the most beautiful one for their home. After all, it was their first Christmas in Allentown, and it should be unforgettable, at least for the children. Jordan volunteered to help bring the tree home. He arrived when they finished breakfast. "Hello?" Carol lowered her gaze. "Jordan, I'm sorry about yesterday. I got upset when I ran into my ex-mother-in-law. It's a long story, but when I lived with my husband, she was really tough on me, you know? I don't know why she was so happy to see me. Something seems off here." "Oh, forget about it." He waved his hand. "Things happen. Carol, I'm not going to argue with you or hold a grudge." "Jordan, hi." Sally ran up to Jordan and hugged him around the waist. "Did you draw more mice?" "I did. Here." And he pulled out a small canvas from his pocket, depicting mice decorating the Christmas tree. It became their little ritual. Carol marveled at how he wasn't too lazy to draw these mice. Sally already had a whole collection. They took a long time choosing the tree. Finally, the woman found what she wanted: lush, tall, dense, and of course fragrant. Then they headed home. Carol decided to invite Jordan for Christmas. She had been afraid of this before. What if he brought wine or vodka and got drunk? But he seemed to have been holding up very well for a long time, or maybe it wasn't worth it after all. Memories of lost loved ones and how they used to celebrate Christmas could be painful. Finally, she made up her mind. "Jordan, would you like to celebrate with us? Nothing special planned, just hanging out, listening to music, having dinner?" "I'd love to. I promise you, nothing like what you're thinking will happen." "Well, what you're worried about?" And Carol felt ashamed again. His insightfulness was enviable. Sometimes it seemed like he could read minds, although that was both good and bad at the same time. He might guess what she felt about him, or just think he knew. They approached the entrance. Carol noticed from afar that someone was sitting on the bench. Strange. Two people, one taller, the other shorter. Maybe they were waiting for someone? The people on the bench were indeed waiting for someone, and that someone was Mrs. Bailey and Zach himself. But what the hell brought them here? "How did you find me?" Carol blurted out. "We found you," Zach replied. "Well, shall we hug it out, kids? I missed you." Sally and Nick stood holding hands and didn't rush to approach their father. "Are you setting them against me or something?" Zach sighed. "I was warned. Carol, let's talk like adults." She noticed that he had changed. His face was swollen and his eyes seemed smaller. Maybe he's sick and decided to say goodbye and talk one last time? "What about?" Carol asked. "You've been gone for over a year, didn't even call." "I accidentally deleted the number, lost my phone," Zach frowned. "And instead of, say, messaging on social media, you decided to find out the number in person." "Carol, let me explain everything." Mrs. Bailey also stood up and approached the woman. "Can we step aside?" Carol looked at Jordan, then at the kids holding hands. Jordan nodded briefly. Carol knew he understood her without words. Don't let Zach near the kids. Who knows what he's up to? Maybe they wanted to kidnap Nick and Sally. Although, how would they do that? There's no car nearby to stuff them into. Mrs. Bailey took Carol by the hand. She flinched. Even her mother-in-law's touch was unpleasant, but she didn't want to break away in front of the kids. They walked away. Carol, help us. Zach hasn't been himself since you left. You disciplined him. After all, children are a responsibility. What do you mean, not himself? Mrs. Bailey lowered her voice. You see, he's been drinking. A lot. I don't know what to do. He's even started threatening. He hasn't hit me, but he's threatened. I'm scared. Please come back. Stop fooling around. A man needs a family. He tried living with one woman and it only got worse. They sat in the kitchen, drinking together. I could hardly kick her out. She then told me that if I pay, she'll leave us alone. Well, I had to give her everything I'd saved up for the sake of my son. I was collecting money for the grandchildren, thinking I'd give it when they grow up. For the grandchildren? Carol was surprised. But they're not your grandchildren. You yourself said they don't look like Zach. Wasn't that the case? Oh, it's not worth listening to an old woman. The ex-mother-in-law smiled, and Carol noticed that one of her front teeth was missing. She felt uncomfortable. Well, I said some things in anger. You weren't always a treat either, looked at me with disapproval. I got offended, that's all. Come back, Carol. Everything will be better with you. No, I won't, Carol frowned. I'm sorry, but I'm not going back. What, you found a new man already, huh? So fast? Mrs. Bailey's tone shifted, becoming angry and slightly threatening. I was right, huh? You didn't even finish divorcing, jumped into bed with a new guy. Carol was surprised. What strange mood swings? Did Zach and Mrs. Bailey synchronously decide to go crazy? And Zach can bring a new woman into the house, huh? Carol inquired. This conversation didn't even irritate her anymore, rather it amused her. Well, he's a man, the elderly woman replied. They see things differently. At least give it a year just for decency's sake. She looked at Zach. Jordan approached him, and they were talking about something, their expressions not boding well. They resembled cats before a fight, staring at each other tensely, as if about to start yelling, shoulders raised to seem more imposing. Meanwhile, Nick held his frightened sister's hand. Carol realized she needed to intervene. It was time to end this strange encounter. They asked her to come back. But why? I'm sorry again, but I have no plans to come back, she told Mrs. Bailey, keeping her eyes on Zach and Jordan. I'm fine here. I have a job, an apartment. By the way, your son hit me. So what? Mrs. Bailey was surprised. He's a man. You probably said something wrong yourself. Do you think my husband never disciplined me? He did. It's just how it is. It's male nature. Oh, you know what? Go to hell with your nature, Carol said, heading toward Jordan. Mrs. Bailey followed her. Carol heard what Jordan said. Leave her alone, okay? Oh, get lost, Zach pouted. His eyes turned into tiny slits. She's my woman. Carol was dumbfounded. My woman. Unbelievable. You'd better leave. She doesn't want to come back to you, Jordan calmly replied. Have you already claimed her as yours? Zach smirked. Well, at least she's good for something. Jordan looked at Carol, then at the children. Please look away, he said to Sally and Nick. They obediently averted their gaze. Carol was even surprised. They were listening to him. After that, she saw Zach flying into the snow and glaring indignantly at Jordan. What are you doing? He tried to get up, but failed. He flailed his arms and legs in the air, resembling an overturned turtle. Mrs. Bailey screamed and rushed to her son. What are you doing, you monster? Carol, let's go, Jordan said. Carol approached her children and hugged them by the shoulders. Okay, let's go home, it's time, she managed to say through gritted teeth. Mrs. Bailey and Zach stayed at the entrance. Jordan effortlessly carried the Christmas tree. Carol was even surprised by how strong he turned out to be. The children remained silent. Carol mentally reproached Zach and his mother. How did they even find her home, although the address was in the documents for child support? And how did she live with him? Why did she marry him? Why did she love him? Although he used to be different. It's understandable why he changed like this. He drinks. A young man, why throw his life away? Why doesn't he even try to fight? At home, they seemed to pretend that nothing had happened. Carol stepped out onto the balcony, sneakily glancing down. Mrs. Bailey and Zach were gone. They probably decided it was time to go home and lick their moral and physical wounds. They arrived right before Christmas, as if they deliberately planned to ruin the mood. and they frightened the children. Carol sent Sally and Nick to their room. "Play, I'll call you for lunch soon," she said. "Mom, it's a good thing we left," Nick suddenly said seriously. "They're kind of strange, Mom." Carol remembered that psychologists advised not to criticize the father in front of the children. She tried not to do that. Apparently, if the children are mature enough, it's not necessary. They understand everything themselves. "Nick, they're just unhappy people," Carol said. "It happens, and we can't help them in any way." And Nick just shrugged, took his sister's hand, and led her to the children's room. Carol and Jordan remained in the kitchen. "That wasn't necessary," she remarked. "A fight is not a way to solve a problem." "I lost control, sorry," Jordan admitted. "Your Zach said some nasty things about you. You didn't hear, and that's good, but I couldn't stand it." "Yeah, and you seem intelligent, an artist," she sighed. "And I'm also an alcoholic, and alcoholics don't control themselves well," Jordan replied seriously. "And honestly, I don't even understand what got into me." "Thank you," Carol suddenly said. "And what for?" "I would like to do this myself, but I can't," she admitted. "And Mrs. Bailey gets on my nerves. She insists that I come back with the children because Zach needs to be kept in line. He can't handle it himself. Oh, no. Let me know. I'll do anything for you and the children." He approached her and looked into her eyes. Carol's legs inexplicably turned weak, and her heart beat faster. "Come on, it's not worth it. We'll handle it ourselves," she said almost inaudibly. "We'll manage. On our own." "You know, Tiffany talked to me about you," he sighed intermittently. "Don't think I've gone crazy, just... She appeared in my dream shortly before you came to me then. It was such a good dream, as if we were sitting together in the park on a bench. It was a sunny day. I looked at her and couldn't believe it. She almost never appeared in my dreams. But then... I asked her why you came, and she smiled so thoughtfully and said that she would come again soon to say goodbye because my life would change and I would change myself. I asked her then, why? What could change? My life ended when they were gone. I wanted to be with them, there, and couldn't. Jordan fell silent. "And then I realized she was talking about you," he continued. "And when I saw you, I thought I would die. No, don't think. Your kids are nothing like mine. Daisy was so shy, and Sally, on the contrary, and Nick was so clever. Mine couldn't sit with his nose in a book, completely different. But it's like I've always loved them, although I didn't know about it, you understand?" "And me?" Carol blurted out. "I can't say yet," the man replied. "I know, but I can't. Not sure yet. I'm not sure if I can hold on any longer. Gave myself a 2-year deadline." Carol understood what he was talking about. 2 years. If he could stay sober for 2 years, then... But it's too early to talk about it. "Let's cook dinner together," the woman suggested. "You peel the potatoes and I'll deal with the meat." And they didn't return to that conversation anymore, but in Carol's heart, there was a certainty that soon everything would be different. As long as he didn't relapse, as long as he kept his promise. And she would wait for as long as it takes because they were already a family. She felt it. He would defeat his dragon and she would defeat hers. She would overcome her distrust, her fears and anxieties. All that remained was to wait and believe in the best, because it would be better and easier. They celebrated Christmas as a family of 4. The kids were delighted with their gifts, especially Sally, who hugged her blue monster all evening. They had also prepared a gift for Jordan. Sally drew his portrait with markers. The man promised to hang it in the most prominent place and even put it in a frame. Nick assembled a model airplane and painted it by himself. Carol received an applique from the children and a ring. It turned out that Nick had been saving for it all year, setting aside a little from his pocket money. The ring was silver with a small zirconium. Carol immediately tried it on, and it fit perfectly. "When did you buy it?" she asked her son. "We didn't go to the city. Did you order it online?" "No, I asked Jordan," Nick confessed. "He went. I said what I wanted." And Jordan nodded. "Yeah, we took a long time to choose. I sent him photos, but Nick didn't like anything. He tormented me." Nick smiled shyly. "Mom, well, I wanted the most beautiful one." Carol suddenly understood. Jordan had added money to buy such a ring, clearly not cheap. Probably it was also a kind of symbol of the future new life, a promise he intended to fulfill. Christmas turned out to be warm. Carol hadn't felt anything like it in a long time. Zach would quickly get drunk during the holidays and either fall asleep right at the table or rush out for a walk, and Carol would dissuade him and ask him to stay home. Today everything was different. Salads, sparklers, dancing around the Christmas tree. Jordan took Sally in his arms and spun her slowly, and she laughed and hugged him around the neck. And Nick danced with his mom, and the look on his face was so funny and serious, touching and infinitely loved. That's how a family should be, and Carol hoped it would continue that way. The next morning, Sally announced that she had a new life goal. She intended to help Nick recover. How? Carol was surprised. What have you come up with? Jordan told me about these paper things, origami. Look. Sally proudly smiled. No wonder she learned such an unusual word. In short, you have to make a wish and make 1,000 cranes. When you make the last one, the wish will come true. Cool, Mom, isn't it? Of course, it's great. The woman nodded. You'll be assembling them alone. It'll take a long time. No, I'll be able to get help. You'll help, right? Jordan promised he would, and he already showed me how to make cranes. But I didn't memorize it, and I haven't succeeded yet. The paper turns into lumps, but I'll definitely learn, Mom. Carol decided to take her daughter's wish seriously, and who knows, maybe it will really work. She allocated a large box from under the boots for the cranes. Together with Sally, they covered it with floral paper and decorated it with little hearts. The girl insisted on it herself. She knew that her brother's heart was hurting. To Carol's surprise, Nick also decided to participate. He quickly mastered the technique of folding cranes and explained to Sally how to do it. Now, in the evenings, they sat making cranes. Sometimes Jordan joined them, but for Carol, there was no time at all. An influenza epidemic had begun, and now she spent all her days at work. She had to travel to neighboring villages often. Patients complained of coughing, body aches, and high fever. Several times they transported people to the city infectious disease hospital. Nick's school classes were canceled due to quarantine. Carol wouldn't have let him go to school anyway. And even without any quarantine, getting the flu for Nick was very, very dangerous. And the children had brought a cat from the street, huge Battered missing one ear, with a huge face frozen in a contemptuous expression towards all representatives of the human race. Mom, look, this is Puffy, Sally said when Carol came home from work. Puffy looked indifferently at Carol and headed towards the kitchen. What do you mean, Puffy? Carol was horrified. Where did you get him? On the street, Mom, said Nick. He was meowing loudly, probably freezing. I walked through the apartments. No one knows whose he is. Can we keep him, huh? He's nice, affectionate. Carol looked at her son's hands, which bore fresh scratches. Yeah, it couldn't be more affectionate. Carol wanted to put on a strict face, but her children's faces were so plaintive. But how could she refuse them? Oh, what a horror. All right, let's keep your Puffy, but you take care of him. Now, Carol's responsibilities included Puffy too, although he hardly caused any problems, preferring to lounge in the armchair or on Nick's lap, purring loudly and behaving dignified and independent. However, in the mornings, he would wake Carol up with his loud meowing. He understood that she was the mistress of the house and demanded breakfast. But the woman quickly got used to it, and she grew fond of the cat. He must have had a rough life. Look how battered he was. Let him enjoy domestic comfort and human love and attention now. Carol was terribly tired and afraid of getting sick herself. Of course, she had a plan for such a case. Betsy would take the children then. No need to infect them. It was mid-January. The woman didn't even have time to take down the Christmas tree. She had so much work to do. However, the children were delighted. Sally even asked not to remove the tree and to leave it until summer, and then just decorate it with apples and cherries. Carol tried to explain to her daughter that it wouldn't work. The tree would already be shedding its needles, and by summer, only the trunk and bare branches would remain. Well, never mind, Mom. I'll glue on some leaves, Sally said. Carol couldn't break away and go home that day. She was asked to stay at work for another day. There were not enough hands. Both doctors and nurses were on duty. Call-outs followed one after another. She sat in the office with Angela, The others went to attend to the next infected. They even had to recruit villagers as drivers. There was a shortage of ambulance vehicles at the hospital, only 2 cars, and both of them were absent from the garage for days. "Oh, what a horror," sighed Angela, looking out the window. "We haven't had anything like this in a long time. What kind of virus is so vicious this year?" "Yeah," Carol replied, trying to stifle a yawn. "The infectious disease department is overcrowded. Nightmare. At least no fatalities so far. I'm just worried about that old lady. She's a jolly one, 97 years old." "Listen, I called about her. They said she's getting better," Carol smiled. "So she'll be back soon and continue driving her daughter-in-law crazy." "Oh yes, that old lady is unpleasant," Angela chuckled. "Reminds me of my mother-in-law. She's always nagging. Either I oversalt the soup or the pie doesn't bake properly, or I'm not raising her son properly." "Yeah, they're all alike," said Carol. She wanted to complain to her colleague about her own mother-in-law. Apparently, almost all of them were like that, with rare exceptions. Maybe when Nick brings a bride, she'll grumble about her all day too. God forbid she becomes like that, of course. Carol mentally promised herself that she would accept any daughter-in-law, and the girl wouldn't hear anything bad from her. Suddenly the phone rang. It was Nick. "Hey, darling," said Carol. "How are you guys? Why aren't you asleep? It's late. Reading again?" "Mom, they cut off the power," said Nick. "There's some kind of outage in all the houses." "Well, then go to sleep," Carol ordered. "There's a flashlight at home if you need it." "Mom, the flashlight doesn't work," Nick admitted. Carol sighed. Of course, he must have been reading again at night and used up all the batteries in the house. She forbids him to read at night. So he hides under the covers. He seems like a smart kid, not little anymore, but still manages to cause trouble. Motherhood is joy, of course, continuous and uninterrupted joy. So wash up, brush your teeth, and go to bed, understood? "Mom, there's no light in the bathroom." "Well then, don't wash up and go to bed with dirty teeth, and tomorrow morning, as compensation, wash up and brush your teeth twice in a row, okay?" "Okay, Mom," Nick chuckled. "Good night." "Oh, I must be a bad mother," she sighed. "Why's that?" Angela was surprised. "The kids are always alone and I'm here." "Oh, everyone's like that. We grew up somehow, remember?" The phone rang. This time it was a work call. Carol and Angela exchanged glances. Probably another emergency. What's going on? No moment of peace. Angela picked up the receiver and started jotting something down in her notebook. "All right, Carol, we need to go. The man's in bad shape." "Well, it's my turn," she sighed. "You went last time." "Yeah, Carol, I know. Come on, go." She got into the car. Carol placed the medicine bag and the blood pressure monitor on her lap and dozed off, leaning her head against the window. It was warm in the car, and she quickly fell asleep. They arrived in about an hour and a half. Normally, the drive took about 40 minutes, but a blizzard had started. Fortunately, the patient had somewhat exaggerated his symptoms. His temperature was 38.5, he had a cough, and complained of a headache. Carol listened to him and didn't detect any wheezing. "Drink more warm liquids," she instructed. "Take medication to lower your temperature as needed. If there are any changes, call me." "Are you going to take me to the hospital?" the man asked. Carol's phone vibrated in her pocket. She decided to answer later. First, she needed to finish. "No, I see no grounds for that," she firmly replied. "But I do. There's an epidemic and I feel unwell." The man crossed his arms over his chest. "Do you even know what you're doing? Did you study medicine?" "There are no grounds," Carol repeated. The phone vibrated again. Probably Angela was hurrying. Another call came in, and there's no one else to go. "All right, I'll write a complaint. Dictate your surname, first name, last name." The man reached for the table and took a notepad. "Refused hospitalization to the patient." "Write it down," Carol sighed. And again the phone. What's going on there? It took about 15 minutes to deal with the dissatisfied patient who was complaining about the quality of care. Carol knew very well he wouldn't actually write a complaint. He was just bored. But as her colleague said, if a patient has the energy to argue with a doctor, it means they're getting better. She left the house. Carol remembered about her phone and took it out of her pocket. Angela had called 7 times in a row without a break. "What's happened?" The car started moving, and Carol dialed her colleague's number. God forbid she's being sent somewhere again. Carol desperately wanted to be in warmth, to drink hot tea and eat the sandwiches Nick had brought from home, lovingly prepared. "Hello, what happened?" "Carol, Carol!" Angela shouted into the receiver. "Hurry home! Your kids, your house! Fire, Carol!" Oh my God. Her heart squeezed, her ears buzzing. What happened? "I'm already here at your house. We've called everyone. Fire. Hurry." "My kids, are they out? Are they safe?" "I'm looking for them, Carol. Come here quickly." Carol couldn't remember how they got to the house. Flames were raging on the 5th floor. Carol jumped out of the car and ran to the entrance where people were gathered. "Sally, Sally, Nick, where are you?" she screamed with all her might. "Mom!" They stood there, huddled together around Betsy. Sally reached out her arms to Carol. The woman lifted her daughter and kissed her on both cheeks. Nick was crying. Someone must have given them their clothes. Sally was wrapped in a jacket. Someone's warm, shearling coat was draped over Nick. "Mom, it's my fault," the boy whispered. I didn't listen to you. I lit the candle and started reading. Then I fell asleep. The candle must have fallen, right into the box with the paper cranes. It all caught fire so quickly. I only had time to grab Sally and run out. I don't remember anything else, Mom. "Oh God, thank goodness you're alive. I thought I was going to die." Carol burst into tears. "But how could this happen? Son, you're not to blame for anything. Absolutely not to blame. Calm down. I love you both." "Mom, Jordan ran back for Puffy," Sally sobbed. "Yes, we couldn't stop him. He's stubborn," Betsy said. Sally started screaming that the kitty was left behind. "Well, Jordan ran like crazy. He looked at me as if saying goodbye." "Oh God, Betsy, how long has he been there?" "Nobody dares to go in. You can't see anything because of the smoke. We're waiting for the firefighters. They will arrive now." Angela touched Carol's shoulder. "Let's go to the hospital. At least it's warm there. You can rest. Why stay here?" "Please, take the kids, Angela. I'll stay here," Carol ordered. "I'm not going anywhere, Mom," Sally cried. "My cranes are there. Nick won't get better without them." "Go on now!" the woman yelled at her daughter. "Okay." It seemed like she raised her voice at her for the first time in her life. But right now, she didn't care. Jordan went to save the cat. Oh God, would he perish? Would he finally catch up with his family over there, in the afterlife, and leave her all alone? "Sally, let's go. Mom will come soon," Nick instructed. "Really?" the girl whimpered. "Will you really come with Jordan?" "I'll come," Carol promised. Without taking her eyes off, Carol stared at the windows of her apartment, behind which the flames were raging. "Oh, Nick, why don't you ever listen to me? And how did you even find candles in complete darkness? I raised a smart boy. But smart ones are always disobedient. They never do what they're told." Not knowing what she was doing, Carol dashed to the entrance. Someone tried to stop her, but she didn't remember anything. She climbed the stairs, pressing her mouth and nose with her sleeve. Breathing was difficult. She could barely distinguish anything in front of her and had to feel her way forward. "Okay, seems like the 4th floor," she muttered. She stumbled over something and fell to her knees, crying out in pain. Jordan was lying on the floor, motionless as if dead. Despite being unconscious, he was holding Poofy, who was breathing heavily. "Jordan, Jordan, wake up!" Carol shouted, her voice strained. Immediately, she began coughing. The smell of burning plastic filled the air, and her lungs burned from the smoke. "Please, wake up." But there was no response from the man. Carol still didn't realize the danger she was in. She grabbed Puffy and tucked him under her arm, then took Jordan's hand and dragged him downstairs as best as she could. She didn't care if he got a couple of bruises. The main thing was to prevent him from hitting his head on the stairs. A few bruises, or even broken ribs, were nothing compared to carbon monoxide poisoning. Carol's head was spinning. Puffy was struggling to break free, but she promised herself that she wouldn't abandon either Jordan or the cat. She wouldn't let him go, even if he wanted to, because she needed him. Her children needed him. She descended to the 2nd floor. It was dark in front of her eyes. She realized that she was about to collapse. "Ma'am, what are you doing?" Someone approached her, someone tall and big wearing a gas mask. Carol squinted. A firefighter. They had finally arrived. "Guys, take care of this," the firefighter yelled. "What are you doing, for heaven's sake?" She ran off and no one caught up with her. Carol heard these words as if through cotton wool, and then she lost consciousness. A fleeting thought crossed her mind. Now everything would be fine. She had managed it. She hadn't abandoned Jordan. She hadn't abandoned the cat. She hadn't let the man go, so everything would be fine. She came to on the street. Strange lights flickered. Carol realized that the ambulances and firefighters had arrived. They were alive, and that was the main thing. Later, in the hospital, she learned that she had saved Jordan's life. If he had spent a little longer in the smoke-filled stairwell, he wouldn't have survived. The children stayed with Angela, who took them in for the 5 days Carol spent in the hospital. Fortunately, her life was never in danger. She wanted to leave earlier, but they wouldn't let her. Before being discharged, she visited Jordan, but he was in the intensive care unit and fast asleep. They wouldn't allow her to wake him. Carol wouldn't have done so anyway. She just made sure he was breathing and gently stroked his cheek. She went to her children, whom she missed terribly. Angela informed her that Carol was entitled to compensation. "We found out everything," she announced. "We wrote a collective letter, signed by the neighbors and the patients you helped. So, you'll get an apartment, don't worry. It's small, but it's renovated." The firefighters arrived just in time, despite the blizzard. Jordan was discharged after 2 weeks. By that time, Carol had already moved to her new apartment, which was allocated to her as promised. She didn't know what to do with the old one, perhaps sell it, or renovate it when she had the strength for better times. Jordan went straight to her. She opened the door, and they embraced without saying a word. Words were unnecessary between them. "How are you?" he finally asked, pulling away from her. "Everything is fine," she replied. "Jordan!" Sally ran out into the hallway and rushed to Jordan. "Thank you for saving Puffy." "Hello," Nick said quietly, still feeling guilty about what happened. Carol hoped that sooner or later, this feeling would pass. "I'm sorry," the boy said. "You're not to blame," Jordan assured him firmly. "Nick, these things happen. It's fate. No one is to blame. I know it better than anyone in the world." He looked at Carol. "I've signed up for a treatment program in the city. You know why. I'll spend a month there at the clinic and then I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you all." "I believe you. I know you'll make it," she replied. "Let's go have some tea. I've baked cookies." A month later, Jordan returned, saying he couldn't guarantee that he believed he had changed forever, but there was always a slight chance he might slip. "I understand," she told him. "We'll help you, Jordan. We'll always be here for you." "Well, do you agree to marry me, to someone like me?" "Of course I do." Carol stroked Jordan's cheek. They got married a month later. On the night before the wedding, Carol had a dream. She was sitting on a bench in the park. It was a sunny day. Birds were singing. A woman of unprecedented beauty sat down next to her, with long blonde hair and blue eyes. Carol couldn't help but stare at her. "Tell him I'm glad," the woman said softly. "I wish you happiness, and don't be afraid. Everything will be fine." "I'm not afraid," Carol replied in her dream. "Because you'll protect us, Tiffany.